Students, thank you for having me into your classroom. As you heard, my name is Ken Morris, and I am the great-great-great-grandson, three greats, of Frederick Douglass, and I'm also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And I know that's a whole lot of greats to try and count, but every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and to Washington. It's kind of like trying to picture like what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know a grandparent. Some of you may even know a great grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors. You see, because my great grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 101 years old, and she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 94, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on the knee of my great grandmother, Fanny, and she would tell me about the man, she would call him the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting at the knee of my aunt Portia, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And when we started our work at Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives back in 2007, I remember being in a classroom, and there were fourth, fifth, and sixth graders, and they were all looking at me kind of like cross-eyed, like, man, you are so far removed, and what does all of this history have to do with our lives today? And why are you talking about these people that lived so long ago? And so I wanted to help give the students some context to help them understand and help you understand the distance between the generations. And I had this thought that I think was kind of a cool thought, that hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man. I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country, especially when you consider the generations. And I know you all have the Douglass Family edition of Frederick Douglass's first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And I'm really excited to be able to give those books to you. And when you look through it, in the back, you're going to see photographs, family photographs. And so some of the people that I'm talking about will be in those pictures, including my great grandmother and my aunt Portia. So make sure you take a look at those photographs, because it'll help to give you a visual of these people that I'm talking about. So my theme is going to be education. Both of my ancestors understood from a very young age that education was going to be their pathway to freedom. And we know from our US history that it was illegal in most cases to teach an enslaved person to read and write. And so both of my ancestors would have to steal their education. And for Frederick Douglass, and I'm going to spend most of my time talking about Frederick Douglass because of the book that you have and what you've been studying. But for Frederick Douglass, later in life, when he was this great big white-haired statesman who was the first African-American nominated for vice president, he was the first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti. He was the first African-American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. And he was the first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor, which was dedicated in 1899, 4 years after he passed away, in Rochester, New York. And people would ask him, they would say, Frederick, where did you go to school? Where did you get this incredible education and all of this knowledge that you have? And having never spent one day of his life in a classroom, he was a self-taught scholar. On occasion, he would respond by saying, my diploma is written on my back. My diploma is written on my back. And so what he was talking about were the 20 years that he was enslaved. Now, he was born into slavery with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He would change his name to Douglass after escaping. He only saw his mother 4 or 5 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, She would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sunup to sundown, walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and then spend just a few moments with him until he would fall asleep. He said that he never saw his mother in the light of day. And then once he fell asleep, she would walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up. And if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face punishment. He used to sleep head first in an old corn sack with his feet hanging out on cold winter nights because that was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. But he did have someone that showed him some love and nurturing and care early in his life, and that was his grandmother, Betsy. And her job on the plantation was to raise the children until they were old enough to really begin their life in manual labor, to start working. And on this plantation, this was around 5 or 6 years old. And you'll notice when I talk about Frederick, I have to use an age range because he didn't know when his birthday was. He had no idea what year he was born. He thought he might have been born in 1817, but it was determined after he passed away that he was actually born in 1818. And there were no birth certificates for the most part for enslaved people. And the only record that mattered to his owner, his enslaver, was how much he was worth on the family accounting ledger because he was property. He did not own himself. And so back to his grandmother, Betsy, she said to him when he was about 5 or 6 years old, "We're going to go on a long journey." And that journey was a 12-mile walk to the big house, to the Y plantation. And this is not the plantation that his mother was on, but this was the big house. And so if you can imagine, that walk took a long time, and he's scared and he's nervous and he's clinging to his grandmother's dress. And she had made this walk many times before with the other children that she had raised until they were old enough to begin their work. And she would carry Fred much of the way when he couldn't carry himself. And then when they would finally get to the Y plantation, Frederick would wander off and kind of check out his surroundings and look for something to eat because he was hungry. And when he turned back to look for his grandmother, she was gone, and he would never see her again. Now, I remember I mentioned that he'd only seen his mother a few times, and he didn't know who his father was. It was presumed that his father was his enslaver, was his master. He had been separated from his brothers and sisters. They were like strangers to him. So he truly was an orphan with no family, no home, and no country. And I say no country because he was not considered a citizen as an enslaved person. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as I move along with my presentation. And so in spite of all of that, through education, he was able to rise up to affect change in the world around him and to affect change for all of us. And you may be asking, well, how was he able to get educated when it was illegal to teach him to read and write? Well, in that autobiography that you have, and I'm going to keep referring to it because I want you to get really excited and interested in wanting to read it and dive into it and to learn about his story, because it is one of the greatest stories in the history of our country. It's a coming of age story. And it's talks about the importance of education, and he keeps hammering about the importance of education, but also the institution of slavery. And we'll get to the book and why he wrote it a little bit later. But back to him teaching himself to read and write, which is what he did. And he wrote in that autobiography, he described a situation that happened in his life as some sort of divine providence in his favor. And that was, he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland. Now, there were hundreds of children because his enslaver had more than 1,000 enslaved people on throughout various farms on the eastern shore. So he was chosen, and he writes in that book, he said, "I was the first, last, and only choice." And there was some sort of divine intervention that happened, he believed, that sent him to Baltimore. Now, the importance of going to Baltimore was he was going to be in the big city. He would be around free Black children. He would be around poor white children. But most importantly, when he gets there, he was sent there to be the house servant for his enslaver's family. And when he gets there, his slave mistress, whose name was Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before. She didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. And just out of the goodness, the kindness of her heart, she was already teaching her young son Tommy to read, And there was Frederick alongside Tommy, just bright-eyed and eager to learn. And here's a really important part of the story that isn't always communicated. We hear about his kind mistress teaching him to read and write. But there's a nuanced point that I've learned most recently in working with a scholar that has been studying my family for more than 30 years and is publishing several volumes of books about my family in 2025. Her name is Celeste Marie Bernier. She's a professor at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And Celeste told me through her research, she determined that Frederick asked Miss Sophia to teach him. And I want you to understand this point, because this is really what I consider his first moment of self-liberation, where he would start to fight for his own freedom. And by asking her to teach him, then she would begin to teach him his ABCs. And that was all he needed, was that little spark of light into his mental darkness, into his mental bondage. And I remember when we first started doing this work, I was in Albany, New York, and I was in a barbershop with a group of African-American teenage boys, teenage young men. And I told that story about him starting to get his ABCs. And there was this young boy, he was about 15, 16 years old, and he said to me, he said, "Mr. Morris, if I could just describe what's going on in my mind," he said, "it's like a pitch black hallway. There are no windows, there are no doors, and I don't know how to get out of this." And he said, "But what you just told me about that little spark of light that was shown into young Frederick Bailey's mental bondage, I now can see a little bit of light into my dark hallway, and I know which way to point. I know which way to go, and I have some hope and some potential direction." And so that's the importance of education. Education is shining a light. Frederick also wrote in that narrative, he said, "I was always so hungry as a slave child. I always had a pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when I would get food, the overseer," and the overseer is the person that is in charge of making sure that the people work, he would say the overseer would take cornmeal mush, throw it into a pig's trough, and all of the children, including Frederick, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, to eat like animals. Because again, that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself. And so if you think about this little boy that wanted education, he wanted to learn to read and write so badly that he would trade something of such great importance, because what he would do with the kids in the neighborhood is he would trade biscuits or he would trade bread for reading lessons. And he would pick up a piece of chalk or a stick and scratch into the ground or the dirt. "Is this how you write an S?" And they would say, "No, Fred, this is how you write an S." And so if you think about this little boy that was always hungry, that he would trade something of such great importance, food, bread, for reading lessons, I hope that you see that Frederick would rather feed his mind than and have his stomach go empty. And so what he continued to do was to self-educate himself. And once he would do that, now he would do that through reading a book called The Columbian Orator, which was a collection of speeches to teach young boys how to speak properly and how to give speeches. That book really inspired him. When he would earn a little bit of money, he would purchase a Bible and he would read the Bible. So he's teaching himself to read and write. But what's happening is he's starting to break the chains on that mental bondage. And he's starting to think critically about his condition of oppression and enslavement. And he's asking questions like, "Why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And how come you know your birthday and I don't know my birthday?" And then he would turn and he would pray to God for deliverance from his chains, from his enslavement. And he would say, "God, I don't understand how my master puts on a suit every Sunday and goes to church and in the Word and the Bible and cherry-pick scriptures finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property." He's starting to, at a young age, make the distinction from what he would write about, again, in that narrative, he would call the slave-holding Christianity of the land versus the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. And so history is not just about the past. And I want you to think about this as I'm going through my presentation. History is important for a lot of reasons. I think it's probably most important that we know where we come from in order to know where we're headed. But history is not just about the past, it's about the present, and it's also about the future. And the better that you know where you come from, the better you can navigate the world in which you live, and you know which way you're headed. And so for Frederick Douglass, understanding history and knowing where he came from was a really important thing in his life. Now, as he's self-educating, he's growing, he's getting smarter, he's getting bigger, he's getting stronger. And what his enslaver predicted happened. He became unruly. He became unfit to be enslaved. You couldn't tell him what to do. And so he was sent to a slave breaker by the name of Edward Covey, and this story is in that book. And when he was sent to the slave breaker, he was hired out to Covey for a full year to work for Covey. And Covey would begin to whip him. He would begin to beat him. And then those whippings became more frequently because he's trying to break him. He's trying to break him just like you would try to break a wild horse or a wild mule. And then the beatings became so frequent that after 6 months of enduring this brutality, Frederick Bailey had had enough. And he decided that he was going to fight back. And he and Covey would have this epic 2-hour battle, which he describes in that book. And it was more of a wrestling match than it was a fight, a fist fight, because Frederick knew that he had to be strategic in the way that he went about beating Covey, because he didn't want to hurt him so badly that he might have faced some sort of fate of being killed himself. And so after that battle ends, Frederick defeats Covey. They're huffing and puffing, and if you can get this visual, and Frederick is standing over Covey, and he looks at him and he said, "You have seen how a boy has been made a slave. Now you see how a slave has been made a man." And while he was not physically free from the chains that bound him, he was on his way to being mentally free. And so back to my point about history not just being about the past, but being about the present. In the same way that Frederick Douglass started to ask critical questions about his condition, I've had an opportunity to work with students all over this country and to talk to them. And I've had students say to me, ask me questions like, well, why is it because I'm born into a certain zip code, I have less opportunity or access to good health care, economic opportunity, the same quality education versus someone else in another zip code? And these students are starting to think about the systems that are in place around them that keep them oppressed, that keep them uneducated, and to keep them ignorant of this history. You've probably heard about books being banned in schools around the country. Do you know the book that you have right there on your desk, Frederick Douglass's narrative, was banned in Edmond Public Schools in Oklahoma in September of 2022, which really just saddens me. It makes me, almost angry, because I know how inspiring the story is. And those students in that school district are not going to have the opportunity to be inspired by my great ancestor story. And so we're working on a project called 1 Million Abolitionists, and we're working to give away 1 million copies of that book so that we can get it into the hands of students that are in some of these districts where books are being banned. And we're also working on putting together a curriculum that would talk about human trafficking and modern day slavery. I'll talk about that and our work at Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives in just a little bit. But I just get back to it. I'm just so excited to be able to share this book with you. And I hope that you'll, if you haven't already started reading it, that as soon as at your first opportunity, you will dive into it and really absorb this story, and to start to think critically about your communities, think critically about your schools, the organizations that you're involved with, the churches that you may go to, and think about how you can start to become an activist in your own right, or a modern day abolitionist. And an abolitionist is someone who works to abolish or end something. In the case of Frederick Douglass, it was the abolition of slavery. So back to Frederick Bailey's story. He would make his first attempt to escape from slavery at the age of 18. He was caught and he was thrown in jail for a couple of weeks in a place called Easton, Maryland. And fortunately, for some reason, we don't know why, Frederick thought he was going to be sold down south, way down south. And had that happen, we likely never would have heard of him. And had that happened, we would be a very different country sitting here today without his contributions. But his enslaver sent him back to Baltimore, and he would work in Baltimore as a ship caulker on the decks. He acquired that skill, and he was able to kind of freely move around the big city. And then he would meet my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. And I want you to listen to her story, because I am just as proud of her as I am of him. Anna was the first person in her family to be born free. And she met Frederick at some point. We're not exactly sure where they met. They were both from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Celeste, the scholar that I was telling you about, seems to think that they may have met even before Baltimore. But in any case, we know that they did meet. Frederick was still enslaved as a teenage young man, and they started to care about each other. And she was one of the first people to plant the seed of thought in his mind that, Frederick, you're not meant to be a slave for life. I don't care what your master says to you. You have a lot going for you. And so he thinks about that. And as they start to fall in love, she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. Had she not sold her personal belongings to help pay for his escape, had she not sewn or put together the sailor's disguise that he would wear, who knows if he would have had the courage or the wherewithal to be able to run away from slavery. And had that not happened, again, we would be a very different country sitting here today. Anna was a radical freedom fighter in her own right. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad, you may know, is a collection of places, spaces, and people working together to help people that were running away from slavery. We call those people freedom seekers, to help them get to freedom. And out of their house in Rochester, New York, Anna helped hundreds of freedom seekers make it to their freedom in Canada. And I don't know if you all have learned about the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law yet. Have you? Just by a show of hands, is that something that you've...
Buddy, hands up.
Okay. All right. Well, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, for those of you that may not know what that was, it was a piece of legislation that changed how people were treated when they ran away from slavery, among a lot of things. So if you were in Kentucky, which was a slave state, and you were able to make it across the Ohio River to Ohio, which was a free state prior to 1850, you could probably just turn around and wave back to your enslaver on the other side of the river and just say, hey, I'm free, you can't come and get me. But after that fugitive slave law was enacted, it meant that you could no longer be free in a place like Ohio, and you would have to go all the way to Canada. If you were running mostly from the upper South, you would have to go to Canada, because Canada had abolished slavery in 1834 in order to be free. And so Rochester and the Douglass home, because of its proximity to Canada, there were a number of people that were going to the Douglass home, which was a station on the Underground Railroad, and Anna would help them, would clothe them, feed them, help them get rested to be able to make the next stage of their journey. So she's a really important piece in the story. Did you have a question for me? I see invisible history. Okay. Walk up to the camera. I thought you wanted to ask me something. So Anna is an important piece of the story. They were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together, and they had 21 grandchildren. Now, in fact, the whole Douglass family was a radical freedom fighting collective. The abolition of slavery and fighting for people's human rights was the family business. And I'm really proud of that legacy and how it's been passed down through the generations. And so Frederick Bailey escapes by train and by boat. He would land in New York City, write a letter back to Anna. She would come and join him, and they would get married and take on the name Frederick and Anna Johnson to make it harder for his enslaver to be able to track him down. And then it was suggested by conductors on the Underground Railroad that they go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Frederick could likely get work on the ship docks there. Remember, I said he had acquired a skill as a ship caulker. And so with the help of conductors on the Underground Railroad and people, they were able to make it to New Bedford. And I'm really proud of them at this point, because while Frederick was still what we would have called at the time a fugitive slave, he was in a free territory, and they were starting their family, and they could have just been happy to be free, start their family. But both Anna and Frederick understood that as long as their friends and family and their people were still in bondage, that they would not be truly free themselves. And so Frederick and Anna would attend an anti-slavery convention on Nantucket Island. And while he was in the audience, the abolitionists that were there, including William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionist leader, they would ask Frederick to just stand up and tell his story. Tell the audience what it was like to be enslaved. And Frederick wrote in that narrative, he said, "I was so nervous that first time speaking in front of a white audience that I was shaking from every limb." But what he was able to do was stand up because he had a natural gift for communication. He was eloquent, he was charismatic, he was theatrical, he was funny in even talking about this descriptions of some of the characters that he would come into contact with. But what he was doing most importantly at that time was he was communicating the inhumanity of slavery to an audience in a way that nobody before him had ever done. And it was a firsthand account. And so he was asked to join the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as a paid lecturer. When they first landed in New Bedford, Massachusetts, they stayed at the home of Nathan and Polly Johnson, and it was suggested that Frederick change his name to Douglass because Nathan Johnson was reading a poem, and one of the characters in the poem had the last name Douglass, and Anna and Frederick thought that sounded good to them, but Frederick wanted to keep his first name, so he became Frederick Douglass, Frederick and Anna Murray Douglass. And now he joins the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as a paid lecturer. He goes from town to town, city to city, just telling a story. Then he started to have a problem. And I want you to listen closely to this, because this is how this book came about. The problem that he had was people started to doubt that he was ever a slave. They couldn't wrap their minds around what they thought a slave looked and sounded like, and what they were hearing in Frederick Douglass, in this good-looking, well-dressed man. Now, I want to stop here for a second and just kind of throw out a point of information to you. You've probably noticed that I've been using the word slave, and I've been using mostly enslaved. And I don't know, this is kind of not really the format where I can ask you questions about what the difference is, because I don't think I'll be able to hear you. So I'll just kind of go through this a little bit. Think about what you think about when you hear the word slave versus enslaved. What does that kind of conjure up in your mind? So a slave, nobody is born a slave. You are enslaved. Somebody has placed that condition upon you. And when you call somebody a slave, and this is something that really bothers me, there are articles that are published about Frederick Douglass every single day. I get Google alerts, and there'll be 10, 15 articles about Frederick Douglass. And almost always, the writer of that article will start with Frederick Douglass, former slave, as if that's his personhood, who, even after all of the things that he did in his life, he was still considered a former slave. Well, he wasn't a slave, he was enslaved. And again, that was a condition that was placed upon him. And if you're enslaved, then there's an opportunity that you can get out of slavery. And I'll give you just one more example. I've been saying freedom seeker versus fugitive slave or runaway slave. When you hear fugitive slave or runaway slave, what does that make you think about that person? That they're breaking the law, right? And they were breaking the law. They were breaking the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And the law that they were breaking was they were stealing themselves. Can you imagine that? When they ran away, they were stealing themselves because they were property. There was some value to them. And when they were stealing themselves, they were stealing that money or that value from their enslaver. And so we want to change the narrative. And it's really important for those of you that like to write, and I hope all of you do, how you use language and how you use words. you can help make your arguments just by changing words. And I'll give you an example: fugitive slave, runaway slave, or freedom seeker. When you say freedom seeker, we're talking about the same person, aren't we? But you think about that person in a completely different way. And so that changes the narrative, and it helps to place these people into the narrative of freedom that the United States always talks about. We fight wars for freedom. Give me liberty or give me death. Everything is about freedom. And so as writers, think about the words you use and how you can help persuade people with your arguments just by selecting words. Don't just gloss over words and just think that they're not important, but the words that you use are very important. So I just wanted to, I kind of veered off a little bit from what I was saying, but I just wanted to make that point so you know, when I say slave, I'm talking about it in its historical context. So when I'm talking about Frederick Douglass's book, An American Slave, you can't change it to an American enslaved. When I talk about the fugitive slave law, you can't change it to the fugitive enslaved law. So there's certain things that it's unavoidable as far as I'm concerned that you have to use that word, but I try and use enslaved as much as I can. And so Frederick is giving these speeches. The problem that he had was people doubted that he had ever been enslaved, and they couldn't wrap their minds around what he looked and sounded like. So in order to prove he was who he claimed to be, he wrote that autobiography that you have, the narrative. And it was first published in 1845. And then he would have another problem after it was published. It became a bestseller. And that's the last thing that you want, is a notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your master. And so he would have to go to Europe kind of as a cooling off period. And he traveled from England, Ireland, and Scotland, talking about the abolition of slavery, selling Irish versions of that narrative, and then raising money to be able to purchase his freedom. He would land in a place called Newcastle upon Tyne, and in England, and with the help of his abolitionist friends, they were able to purchase his freedom from his enslaver for 150 pounds, or what would have been $711 at that time. And that was a lot of money. That's about $40,000 in today's money. He was able to come back to the United States a free man. He and his family would settle in Rochester, New York, where he would begin to publish the North Star newspaper, which became the leading abolitionist voice. Then he would go on to become an advisor to President Lincoln during the Civil War. And he, along with the other abolitionists, were largely responsible for pushing Lincoln or agitating Lincoln to the point where he would sign the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, which, by the way, you may know that that proclamation only freed those that were enslaved in the states that were in rebellion to the Union or had joined the Confederacy. It didn't free those that were enslaved in the border states. So it would take the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment to end legalized slavery. And I'll pause there for a second and ask Barry or the teachers in the classroom how much time we have for me to go on and talk about our work at Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and how we're continuing that fight for freedom.
So, Mr. Morris, I'd say you have 15 more minutes.
Okay.
Will that be enough time?
Yes. Does that include
And then we'll
questions?
have 15. Yeah. And then after 15 more minutes talking about your organization, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions.
Okay. Very good. That sounds good. So
Okay.
Thank you. So that's Frederick Douglass. And I'll just tell you really quickly, because I never want to be in front of students and not talk a little bit about Booker T. Washington. I won't spend nearly as much time as I just did with Frederick Douglass. But I just want to tell you that Booker T. Washington benefited from the work of Frederick Douglass and the signing of that Emancipation Proclamation. And he was freed when he was 9 years old. He lived in Virginia. And so he wanted to go to school so badly after he was freed. He worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia at night so he can save enough money to go to school. He would hear about this place called Hampton Institute in Virginia, which Hampton University is still around to this day. It's an HBCU, which means it's a historical Black college and university. Booker T. Washington wanted to go there so badly, he would make a 500-mile walk at the age of 16 to go to school. He would eventually get admitted after being turned away many times, but he would not take no for an answer, and he kept coming back and he kept coming back. He would start at 16 years old, graduate 3 years later, come back to Hampton as a teacher, and then in 1881 he got word that there was a group of people down in a place called Tuskegee, Alabama, that had some money to start a school for formerly enslaved people, and they wanted to model that school off of the industrial education you would get at Hampton. And industrial education was learning a trade, learning how to be an entrepreneur, learning how to farm the land, getting just some sort of education that would help you be able to make a living. And so Booker T accepted that job. He went down as the founder and principal of Tuskegee Institute, which opened in 1881. Tuskegee University is still there today, and that is Booker T. Washington's legacy. And at some point, I would love to be able to talk to you about Booker T. Washington and give you his story, because it's just as amazing as Frederick Douglass's story. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about him, and I hope that that will spark some interest in you wanting to learn more about him. And so now I'll tell you my story in the 13 minutes I have left. I always knew that I was a descendant of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. There wasn't a time when someone sat me down and said, hey, we've got something really important to tell you. I just always knew. I spent all of my summers in Frederick Douglass's summer beach house, which was built on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay by my great-great-grandfather, Charles Douglass, who was Frederick and Anna's youngest son. Charles had purchased 40 acres of real estate, and he started a beach resort town called Highland Beach, and it's in Maryland. It was one of the first Black resort communities. And Charles purchased those 40 acres, and then he sold off parcels as a real estate developer, but he kept one for his family. He kept another parcel for his brother Haley, and then he kept a parcel or a lot for his father to build a retirement home. And so he asked his dad, Frederick, are there any special features that you want in the house? And Frederick said, yes, I want it to sit on the water. I want it to point in a certain direction, and I want you to build a tower at the top. And what he wanted to do at the end of his life was sit up in that tower, look back across the water, look back across the Chesapeake Bay, because on the other side, you can see land. And that land is the eastern shore of Maryland, where he had been born into slavery and where he toiled away in chains. And do you remember I said history is important because we need to know where we've come from in order to know where we're headed? And Frederick understood that as well. And even though he had been enslaved for the first 20 years of his life and he carried those scars on his back, he never wanted to forget where he came from. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of months before the house was completed, so he never got a chance to live in it. But I spent all of my summers in that house until I was 18 years old. And that's where I would sit at the knee of my great-grandmother. She would tell me about Frederick Douglass, and she would point across that water and tell me the stories about him being an enslaved boy on the other side. And there were images of my ancestors in every room. And I remember one night, at the top of the stairs, there's this larger-than-life portrait of Frederick Douglass. And for those of you that have seen his image, a lot of times when people visualize Frederick Douglass, they think about the elder statesman, the grandfatherly figure, the person with the white hair, the safe Frederick Douglass. And we were very purposeful to put the young Frederick Douglass on the cover of our book. But if you've seen any of his younger pictures, his abolitionist years, he was very purposeful and strategic in the way that he presented himself. And so I had the opportunity to work with 3 scholars, and in 2015 we published a book called Picturing Frederick Douglass, where we made the case that he was the most photographed American of the 19th century. He was photographed more than Abraham Lincoln, more than Ulysses S. Grant, and his only contemporaries in the entire world that were photographed more than he was the British royal family. And the reason that he took so many pictures was because he wanted to present himself in the way that he wanted to be seen. At that time, people that were pro-slavery and the federal government would make excuses to try and justify enslaving people and taking away their humanity and exploiting them and brutalizing them. And they would say things like, well, these people of African descent are not worthy of freedom. They're not worthy of citizenship. Perhaps they're better off in slavery. At least they're getting some level of care. Listen to the happy songs that they're singing. They're trying to make a group an other to justify taking away their freedom. In addition to that, he was fighting this notion in the public consciousness through racist caricatures that were out there, cartoons. People would draw Black people with exaggerated features, with sometimes even with tails, to show them as less than human. And so Frederick said, when you look at a picture of me, you're going to look me in the eye, and you're never going to deny that I'm a man worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship. And he also said, which I love, he said, I am never going to look like a happy, amiable, fugitive slave. And so when you see those pictures with that defiance and that steely glare looking directly into the camera, that's what he did. So in this portrait at the top of the stairs, he looked like that. And as a 5-6-year-old boy, I didn't know anything about his strategy. I didn't know why he looked like that. But all I know, I remember saying to that picture, man, you look mean. And I'm glad I didn't know you. And as I would try and sneak past that portrait, you know what would happen? His eyes would follow me. And by the time I got down to the end of the hallway, I could feel that steely glare burning like fire on the back of my neck. And I always imagined in my little boy imagination this booming baritone voice bellowing down upon me. And he would say, "You will do great things, young man." And I remember at that time feeling a lot of pressure and feeling like I was kind of in this long, vast shadow of my ancestors' legacies. And around that time, I started to notice that my ancestors were on statues, and they were on money and postage stamps, and schools were named for them, and bridges were named for them, and libraries were named for them. And I really didn't want any part of that when I was younger, because the few times that I told people of my relationship, nobody ever believed me. And I never thought that it was a point worth arguing. I even had teachers that didn't believe me the few times that I had the courage to say it. So if you can imagine being younger, people not believing you, it was something that embarrassed me. And so I didn't talk about it. And I'm going to fast forward to many years later. I'm a father, a husband. I'm running my own business, and I read a National Geographic magazine, and the cover story was 21st century slavery. And it was an article about human trafficking and modern day slavery existing all over the world. This is how Barry and I would eventually meet. The work that he was doing on researching these underground railroad sites and nominating them to the Network of Freedom. And he wanted to raise money for our organization for the human trafficking prevention education work that we were doing. And so that article in National Geographic just punched me squarely between the eyes. It shocked me. And I'd heard about slavery existing today, but I thought that it happened in far off places. But it happens all over the world, including the United States, including all of our communities. It's in our backyard. And so I started to think about, how could I do something about this? And I had this aha moment, this epiphany, where I did realize that I had on one side the legacy of the great abolitionist in Frederick Douglass, on the other side the legacy of the great educator Booker T. Washington. Aha, abolition through education. One of the things that I forgot to tell you, when Frederick's mistress was teaching him to read and write, his master found out about the lessons, and he got angry. And when he found out, he looked at young Frederick and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." Now, did you all hear that message? I hope you heard it. I'm going to say it again. If you teach him to read and write, it will unfit him to be a slave. He will be running away with himself. And so when we started to think about how we can contribute to the anti-slavery, anti-human trafficking cause, we thought about that story, and how can we, through education, unfit communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive. And so we started the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives in 2007, my mom and I. And my mom, by the way, is the person that united the bloodlines of the families. You'll read about it. I wrote the foreword of that book. So I didn't want to tell you the story, because maybe I'll come back and ask you how that happened. It's in the book. My mom's mother was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. My mother's father was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. The story of how they met at Tuskegee is in the book, so make sure you read it. Their wedding day photo is in that photograph section at the back of the book, so you can see that as well. So we started our organization. We immediately turned to schools. We developed what we call service learning or civic engagement curricula called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. That power of one is service that we want students to be inspired to do in your communities. How can you become a modern day abolitionist, like a Frederick Douglass, a Sojourner Truth, a Harriet Tubman? How can you be an activist like a Booker T. Washington, or an educator, or Cesar Chavez, or Dolores Huerta? Pick your freedom fighter of choice. And what I want you to encourage you to do is to use your talent, your creativity, and harness that passion you may have to work on those issues that are most important to you. I've had students tell me that they're interested in fighting for human rights, fighting for the rights of women and girls. I've had students tell me that they're interested in advocacy around climate change or advocacy around gun safety legislation. Whatever it is within you, you have that talent and passion to be able to affect change in the world around you. When you learn about people like Frederick Douglass and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and many other people, they were not that much older than you are right now when they would begin their work. They weren't, I'm sure, thinking about we would be talking about them 150 years later, and we would be putting them up on pedestals and calling them heroes. They just did the work. Frederick Douglass said it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I would add to that, and broken women. And at our organization, we're working to build strong children. Booker T. Washington said, if you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else. And that's a message about service in your community. And so once you get inspired to work on these issues, we would love to have you involved with our organization and help us deliver human trafficking prevention education to students all over the world. I would love that, but I realize there may be things that you might be passionate about other than that. I remember when I first started, there was this young man in the back of the room, and I could see that he was getting really angry when I was talking about my human trafficking work. And then he raised his hand and he said, asked me, why are you up there talking about human trafficking? I just came from 7-Eleven and there was a homeless man outside, and that's what I'm most concerned about. And I said, great, as long as these stories are inspiring you to look at these issues and to want to affect change in the world around you, that's what I hope this book will do. And I promise me that you'll pick it up and you will read it and be inspired to want to affect change in the world around you. And I'm going to close before we get to the Q&A just with a quick story. I want you to think about this idea that history lives in all of us. History doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that you've heard of, but history lives in each and every one of you. And for those of you that have researched your family tree, you may have found great heroes and heroines that may have given of their lives just for the freedoms that we do have in this country, may have given of their lives just so that some of us can sit in a classroom and legally get an education. And think about this idea that we all stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us. And I'm going to tell you a story that I wrote about in that book because I think it's something that really inspired me. Again, when we first got started, that same classroom of 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, there was a 10-year-old girl that raised her hand, and she was so excited to share something with me. She said, Mr. Morris, I want to tell you that my great 4 greats grandmother was born into slavery. She taught herself to read and write in secret, and then she ran away and she became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist. And she knew what that word meant. A philanthropist is somebody that gives money away for causes that they believe in and to help people. And so she said she was a businesswoman and a philanthropist, and she's just bouncing up and down. And so she said, so Mr. Morris, do you know what all of this means? And before I had a chance to respond, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do. You all have greatness flowing through your veins. And when you think about this idea of carrying your history forward, For those of you that choose to have families or maybe have kids one day, what will your great, great, great grandchildren say about you 150 years from now in this moment in time in which we find ourselves in? We're living in a country that is as divided as it's been in a long time. The political divisiveness that's out there, the rhetoric or the way people talk about other people. Remember I said those enslaved Africans were not worthy of freedom. They were better off in slavery. Let's make them an other. History is not just about the past, it's about the present and it's about the future. Think about other ways that some of our politicians talk about groups and make them an other. They're coming to our country to invade us. They're criminals. They're bringing diseases. They're not worthy of being in this country, even though their parents or these people want the opportunities that are offered here in the United States. And in the same way, I think about Kentucky being a slave state. You've got the Ohio River as a dividing line, and then you've got Ohio as freedom. And so if you were in Kentucky and you were slaving away every single day and you're looking across that river and you're thinking, all I have to do is get across that river and everything changes in my life. Everything changes for my children. Everything changes for the opportunity that we could have. Think about the border of Mexico in the same way, the dividing line between oppression and freedom and opportunity. So history is not just about the past, it's about the present, it's about the future. And history, you have to think about it in ways that how does it help to inform us today? How does it help to inform you as you're going through your education? Well, I know for me, learning about history inspires me when I hear about what our ancestors, all of our ancestors went through, the struggle, the sacrifice, what they endured to make the world a better place for us today. How are we going to make the world a better place for our descendants? One final thought. When Anna told Frederick Douglass he was not meant to be a slave for life, she planted a seed of thought in his mind, a positive seed of thought in his mind that has reverberated throughout history. You know how when you throw a pebble into a lake and you see those circles, those concentric circles that just ripple, ripple, ripple on and on and on? That's what Anna did. By planting a positive seed of thought, it changed all of our lives. In the same way that a negative seed of thought planted in somebody's mind 150 years ago would negatively impact all of us. So as you're interacting with your friends, your family, your classmates, make sure you're always planting positive seeds of thought, because I guarantee you that will ripple throughout time. And we don't know how that's going to affect people 150 years from now. So always remain positive and encourage each other and lift each other up. And remember, history lives in you, but the future depends on how you carry your history forward. So with that, thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I